And we're gonna go. All right. Good afternoon. My name is Christine Hull. This will be Unit 1 for the We the People National Finals. This is our third day with the top 12. We are here with the Virginia Wild team. In a moment, I will have the judges introduce themselves, followed by the students, and then we will begin the hearing. Students will deliver a 4-minute prepared statement, followed by 10 minutes of judges' questions. My microphone will be muted during the hearing, but I will hold up the 1 minute and the time signs. I suggest you use gallery view rather than speaker view. And at the conclusion of the hearing, judges will give a brief feedback to the team, and then we will conclude. So, judges, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Margo Lambert. I'm a professor of history at the University of Cincinnati, Blue Ash College. My specialty is early American, so my time in Virginia has been spent mostly in the DC area where I got my PhD, and of course in Williamsburg. That's where all early Americanists like to hang out.
And hi, my name is Tanya McConnell. I was a professor of history at Columbia College in South Carolina for about 20 years, but right now I'm teaching social studies in high school with some students very much like you. I'm honored to be with you guys today. And not
again, it's great to see you. I'm Sue Leeson, still a senior justice of the Oregon Supreme Court. I knew I'd see you again.
Yes, we're excited to see you.
So please introduce yourselves. Tell us where you're from.
Good evening. We are the wildcard team from Douglas Southall Freeman High School in Henrico County, Virginia. My name is April Miller.
My name is Aubrey Walker.
I'm Cindy Shea.
My name is Riley Spidell. Our instructor is Mr. Rob Peck, and we're looking forward to our conversation with you tonight.
Wonderful. And I'll start us off. We are doing question 2. You want to prepare yourselves. Okay. So on question 2, the foundation for good government is the rule of law. John Adams once wrote, "Good government is an empire of laws." How, if at all, is the rule of law embedded in our founding documents? What challenges to the rule of law, if any, have we experienced in our history? In what ways, if any, has the rule of law been important in the preservation of a free society? You may proceed.
Rule of law is one of the main pillars of our American government. It consists of 2 principles: that the government and its citizens are accountable to the law, and that the rights of the citizens under the law are protected. Rule of law, rooted in the Magna Carta, forced the King of England to remain accountable to British citizens. This principle was upheld as the preceding kings re-signed the Magna Carta as well. Despite setting this exemplary precedent, Britain violated rule of law in the American colonies by refusing to uphold individual rights. While trial by jury was partially established in Clause 39 of the Magna Carta and later reaffirmed in colonial charters, the practice was ended with the passage of the Stamp Act. Thomas Jefferson spoke out strongly against this action, calling the right to trial by jury, quote, "a right so fundamental and so sacred to the citizens that it should be jealously guarded." Both the positive and natural law of the colonists were violated, and this provoked the American people to revolt.
Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution outline separation of powers and checks and balances on each branch of government. Stated in Federalist 51, limited government prevents one branch from exerting too much power. Article 1 establishes impeachment as a way to punish government officials when they violate rule of law and overstep their power. The Supremacy Clause of Article 6 dictates the federal law as the, quote, supreme law of the land. Trial by jury in Article 3, Clause 3, protects those most vulnerable to the government, as rule of law without protection of rights is tyranny.
There are many examples of unjust laws and unjust court rulings in American history. Segregationist Jim Crow laws, upheld by Plessy v. Ferguson, are a prime example of this. Buck v. Bell, in which the court allowed the sterilization of a mentally disabled woman, is another. The government's allowance of segregation and eugenics demonstrates the fallibility of the entire system.
Historically, Americans have experienced many challenges to rule of law, like the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts, which restricted the speech of American citizens and threatened to jail or deport dissenters of the war, violated the free speech clause of the First Amendment. These acts disrupted the natural law of American citizens, which had been implemented into the Constitution. Despite the Alien and Sedition Acts being the law, they were at heart a violation of rule of law.
Article 2, Section 4's impeachment clause delineated that the president must be guilty of, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors to be impeached and convicted. By purposefully making this process vague and relatively undefined, It impeded the process of impeachment, even when a crime had occurred. Since the establishment of this clause, only 3 presidents have been impeached, 1 twice, and none have been convicted. However, despite these difficulties, US v. Nixon demonstrated that presidents can be held accountable under rule of law, as the court ruled that the president must turn over the subpoenaed tapes in the Watergate investigation.
In more recent years, people began advocating for minority rights through the Black Lives Matter protests and the Stop Asian Hate movement. These movements are examples of people exercising their First Amendment rights of speech, petition, and assembly. Because these movements operate within the rule of law, using law in order to create societal change, they uphold a free society and embody Martin Luther King's principle of, quote, an unjust law is no law at all.
It is the duty of a nation's citizens to challenge their government if they feel it is unjust. The movements previously mentioned are good examples of people fighting against oppression and discrimination. By exercising these rights and having the legal ability to do so, these members of society ensure that our government remains lawful. By ensuring the appropriate emphasis on equal application of the law and protection of rights, we ensure that our society remains a free one. Thank you, and we stand ready for your questions.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful opening statement. My question is going to be, when, if ever, can the president be above the law? Can you cite any examples in American history where you would argue it is acceptable, and why or why not?
Federalist 70 outlines that there's something called energy in the executive, which gives the president certain powers and sometimes is often put above the law. One example of this is executive privilege, in which the president has the ability to withhold information from Congress or from the public if it is injurious to the public. This was established in American history with George Washington, who refused to allow the House of Representatives to see the Jay Treaty between the United States and Britain. Another historical example of the president going above rule of law can be seen in the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus from DC to Maine. While this was a violation of protection of rights, it was necessary at the time to uphold and preserve the State of the Union as we knew it.
A more modern example of this is the Clinton versus Jones case, where while some thought it was a move in the right direction where presidents would be held accountable for their actions, the fact that it was registered as a civil case, even though some may see it that it should have been registered as a criminal case, shows that they're still able to evade the natural law principles that should have followed, just because they are president and they are in that position of power.
Is there a conflict between the rule of law and the ideals of democracy?
I would argue no. Our democracy is founded on the idea of rule of law, and we see this date back to why we separated from Britain, because our rule of law was being heavily violated upon with the violation of trial by jury of peers and habeas corpus. And I think this is outlined perfectly in the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson. And he states that if the government is violating our rights, failing to protect the rights of the people, then it is absolutely our duty to overthrow that government.
Or that,
And not only is rule of law inherent to democracy, it is inherent to good government itself, as John Adams states in Thoughts on Government. In fact,
let me challenge that for a little bit. I'm thinking of cases where Congress passed laws or presidents did things that were extremely popular, like a Japanese relocation that was challenged in Korematsu. It was incredibly popular. It was a democratic thing to do. And yet I think we'd probably agree that that violated the basic concepts found in the rule of law of equal justice. Or even the laws, the 1968, 69 Civil Rights Acts, they were incredibly unpopular, especially in the South. They were seen as the corruption of democracy. And while we might see that differently, they were certainly not democratic as they were understood at the time. So does that reflect a conflict at all, or is there a way we can still avoid that or resolve that?
I would agree with you in cases like Korematsu v. US, where it did violate law, but I would argue that it violated natural law in the sense that we as a society don't know how to implement natural law within our society. So we have positive law and we follow the supreme law of the land, which is the Constitution. And this is outlined in Article 6 of our Constitution. I would also like to note the importance of protection of rights within democratic republics. As my colleague mentioned, the court case of Korematsu v. US was a violation of rule of law. And we also have examples of legislation that may be the law of the nation, but they are not necessarily, since they do not protect rights, they do not fall under the rule of law, like the Chinese Exclusion Act or the immigration quotas of 1921 and 1924.
Thank
I want
you.
to deal with what struck me as a bit of a tautology, and I need your help working through it. You said the rule of law is one of the great pillars of our constitutional system. Governments and citizens are subject to the laws. Citizens' rights must be protected. And you go on to say an unjust law is no law at all. And my head is now blowing open about then what is the rule of law? Does rule of law just collapse at some point when, if based on some law even higher than the principle of rule of law, you say, hey, that law wasn't just? And we can talk Korematsu, Chinese exclusion. We've got a myriad of examples that we could pull up. How do we work our way out of this trap?
The best way to avoid the collapse of the government when rights are not protected is to force the government again and again to protect rights. We can see this throughout English history. When the rights of British citizens were not protected, they signed the Magna Carta. When they were again not protected, the British citizens moved towards the Petition of Right, the Triennial Act, the Habeas Corpus Act, the English Bill of Rights. This was caused by the English Revolution. This was caused by British citizens protesting that their rights were not being protected by the government.
Okay, is there a hierarchy of rights that deserve protection in some order? In other words, are rights relating to personal security, should they have priority over rights to expression or assembly?
I would say yes, and we can look at John Locke's 2 treatises on government to delineate these rights relating to personal security, life, liberty, and property. These rights are the ones that tend to lead to revolution, because when these rights are violated, the government is overstepping its bounds. It is important to note that when we create a good government, the government, as Plato's theory of the form suggests, must be trying to be the best it can be. It must be moving to become the most just form of government possible. And the most egregious example of a government moving away from becoming just is when it violates these personal security rights.
Okay, so now I'm going to take you one more step. We have at least 24 states that are severely restricting voting rights for the upcoming election, making it more difficult to register, putting up all kinds of barriers to the right to vote. Is that less important than laws that restrict other rights?
Can I have an example of another right you're referring to, just for context?
Well, non-unanimous juries, which are allowed in my state. That goes right to my right to a fair trial. Is that more important than my right to vote? I'm wondering how you prioritize, given the framework you've come up with. We're not going to get everything right or perfect. Are some rights more important than others to fit into this notion of rule of law?
The way I think of it is coming back to Martin Luther King's famous quote of the arc towards a moral universe is long, but it leads towards justice. And while our government has made mistakes in the past, it's almost as if like we make progress and then we slip back up, and then like our government makes progress again. Like Brown v. Board was only passed like in my grandparents' lifetime. Like my grandparents went to segregated schools, and now we're still having another civil rights movement again with the Black Lives Matter protests. And going off of what April said with Plato's eternal forms, the idea that we all strive as a society to have the most just society, is what our government and what our communities and what each citizen should try and be a part of. And that has to do with the moral codes we have as a society, which changes over time, coming back to Martin Luther King's quote, and the ethics we have for ourselves. And over time, ethics have been debated since the beginning of ancient Greeks. And they've been debated, people have different opinions, but overall, I think we are all striving our best for a government. And the idea of our best changes over time, but it leads towards justice.
Right. I would certainly like to argue that some rights are more important than others. I mean, the Anti-Federalists' main concern was that their rights were outlined within the Constitution. That was the only way the Constitution was ratified. And we see that oftentimes our private liberties, our private individual rights will go towards furthering rights that are good for the common whole, rights such as freedom of speech, freedom of petition, freedom of press. All of these first are given to us, and we use these in order to make sure our whole community is thriving.
And also, it's important to note that we have to view this on a case-by-case basis. It's impossible to draw a line in the sand to say which rights are more important than others. It's impossible to rank rights.
Let's get to a better question. I think I led us down a bunny trail. Go ahead, Tandy.
Okay, I'm sorry. You talked about the king, going back to the very beginning, you talked about the king's accountability to the citizens. Was the King of England ever accountable to the citizens or accountable to Parliament? And is there a difference there?
Big difference.
Oh, there is most certainly a difference between being accountable to Parliament and the citizens. And I do appreciate you bringing that up because factually the king was accountable to Parliament. Again, as my colleague mentioned, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it leads towards justice. While the king was only accountable towards Parliament, this is a step in the right direction. This is a step towards hearing the people's voices in government. While it was not perfect, it is the beginning of the democratic system that we see today.
Very good place to end on.
She was so excited for that question. She has so much research on that.
Love English history.
It's like,
Oh my
Yes,
God.
yes. Wonderful. I'm glad then you got to share that with us. That was very, very nicely done. Again, your understanding of the overall history is remarkable. And I've studied English constitutional history, ancient English constitutional history as a graduate student and loved it as well. All the examples you gave were very good. I thought your answer to my first question was very well done. And I just want to say overall, your presentation, I'm not sure what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is you guys did a remarkable job of getting this material across, of understanding it, of relating it to us in an understandable fashion. And even when, there were moments of a little bit of worry or despair, maybe that's too strong, but you guys rallied and came back and were just did very, very well. That's what I'm trying to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great
Go ahead,
job.
Tandy. Yeah.
I was just going to say, great job. That was one of those off the wall questions that because I circled that when you had initially talked about that. No, wait a minute, let's think about that. I am so glad I asked that question. Go ahead, Susan.
I thought you did another very fine job. And it would have been just fine at the outset of your presentation when you're talking about the Declaration of Independence, say, hey, that was a straw person set up king in the list of grievances. Parliamentary supremacy was well in place. And it's the only accurate part of that list of grievances is when they say he has conspired with others. That's Parliament. But that's the Declaration is largely a rhetorical document. And remember that those list of grievances are set to a candid world to be the judge. And if the candid world says, you're just a bunch of little spoiled colonists, we can't win a revolutionary war. That has to be a very persuasive piece of rhetoric in order to get France to help us out and perhaps bail us out. So you could have brought your excellent research to bear in your opening statement and really hit one out of the park. I'm not sure I share your confidence that the arc of history is moving towards justice. That makes me too confident that history is going to save me. I think we're going to have to save ourselves, and I think it's going to take one heck of an effort in this country to pull back so much of essentially an attitude that the rule of law doesn't matter. What matters is me and my friends, or me and my cohort. Rights need to be protected, yes, but rights also have to be respected and the rights of others have to be respected. And we just seem to fall out of that sense of duty to others and their rights. And I don't know how you work that into your concept of rule of law, but I think that's why this is such a great Unit 1 question. It's not just about rights, it's about reciprocal responsibilities and respect for others, which is a much more classical notion that I think enters into this second question, just as it did into the first question that we talked about yesterday. What are we going to do if an elected official or even former elected official doesn't comply with a legal order? We may be on the verge of seeing that. You may have seen that a New York Supreme Court judge, which is a trial judge in New York, has issued a subpoena to the former president. And it's going to be wild to see A, how far up that's appealed, and B, whether there is compliance. And then what do we do? Anyway, you just, as you did yesterday, have me thinking about a ton more things than I did when I came in, and that's a sign of a really great presentation. So many thanks and best.
Nicely done.
Thank
Thank you.
You gave us a lot to
Yes,
think about
thank
too.